Have you ever had that one mate whose car is just an absolute bomb? I mean, it's a wreck. The tyres are bald, the engine's pretty much burnt out, it hasn't given any clear indication for any direction in years, yet they still somehow manage to get to the party every time on time. That was the Essendon Football Club's 2019 season. I mean, they had no right to be in finals with the form they headed in on. Yet, hey, they rocked up and they were in the mix. I mean, yes, they got smashed by West Coast in the first round and it's still been like 5,000 days since they were able to win a final, but they were there. So it makes this review a little hard to do. Without further ado, let's hop to it. Well, after picking up like the sixth best player from a barely above middle of the pack club, Essendon were clearly on track to win a premiership. Right, Bombers fans? I mean, mortgaging your future to bring in Dylan Shield comes with some pretty high expectations. Expectations that were pretty mixed for a guy that you could argue had been overrated at his previous club, given the talent he was playing around. However, to be fair, at the time, a mixture of Merritt, Heppel, Shield, and some of the other guys they had around the fringes like Sard and McGrath sounded pretty deadly. I personally was all for it. I wasn't necessarily in the top 4 bandwagon, but I thought the Bombers would be pushing for that top 6 spot. They still had Michael Hurley holding the fort defensively, they still had Joe Danaher and dreams of him having a healthy body. So yeah, I can get why the preseason expectation was so high. And then, as it does every year, came round 1. They were belted by the GWS Giants, and then they went on to lose to St Kilda in week 2, and all of a sudden we were all feeling pretty foolish about the high hopes we held for Essendon. However, they did manage to win their next 3, get to 3-2 on the record, and start looking like they were playing some semblance of footy until they ran into Collingwood at the MCG, which sparked another stretch of losses. The first half of the season was kind of what we'd seen from the Bombers for years. They were just sort of continuously treading on the tightrope. We were wondering which side of the ledger they were going to fall and when it was going to happen. But luckily for them, they ran into some pretty easy teams mid-season and managed to string together 5 straight wins, a run that would eventually define the fact that they would play finals, as no other team around them wanted to actually steal their spot in the top 8. Funnily enough, that run started with a win over GWS, the team that had absolutely destroyed them in week 1. And from there, they kind of just went on to pile up a bunch of wins over middle-of-the-pack clubs, which were pretty valuable given that they're a middle-of-the-pack club themselves. But at the end of this stretch, where they fell over the line against Gold Coast, almost literally, the tank in that car we talked about earlier was basically running on empty. Their streak came to a close when they were absolutely pumped by Port Adelaide, but it was the next week that would go on to be the result that everyone's going to remember from the Bombers season, and not for good reasons. They faced the Bulldogs and got absolutely torched. Funnily enough, it was Dylan Shield that kicked the first goal of this game, coming in like the first 20 seconds, and from there they did not score for 108 minutes. 108 minutes! How do you not kick a goal in 108 minutes of footy? It was staggering. The Bulldogs just absolutely put them to the sword, and it was probably the most pathetic effort that any team dished up this season. Not exactly what you want at round 21 when you're trying to hold on to your final spot. I mean, let's be frank. It was a disaster. An absolute disaster. And not even a win over Freo the next week and an admirable loss to Collingwood could mask the stench of their poor form as they limped into the finals and were bound for a trip to Perth to play West Coast. It was an equation that basically summed up that their streak of not winning a final would continue, and they were thoroughly trounced by West Coast in the first round. So that wrapped up their season, and it's really hard to put a grade on where the Bombers stand, given the fact that they did make finals. That's a tick. They also were pretty bad for a long period of time. That's a negative. So instead of trying to grade the team, I went and looked at the fan base, and I thought about how they thought their season went. Were they positive and optimistic that they had made finals? Or were they frustrated? In the end, I kind of settled on the latter of the two, because I don't think Bombers fans are happy being the 7th team. This year there were clearly 6 very good teams who could all win games in the finals. The Bombers thought acquiring Dylan Shiel and the price that they had paid for him was going to take them to being in that top 6 teams. It clearly didn't. The difference between them was still stark. It's okay to sit there and be better than Fremantle and Port Adelaide and St Kilda. That's not bad, but it's not good enough to still be falling short of the Geelongs, the Richmonds, the West Coasts of the world. They're trying to bridge this gap and nothing is actually helping them do it at the moment. Dylan Shiel was not the answer that they were looking for. It's obvious in terms of players lists that there's some talent on this list while also still having a huge amount of holes on this list. But also just in base statistics, the Bombers need some improvement. To give you a fair idea of why I said they had no right playing finals, 13th would have been a more fitting finish given that's where they ranked in kicks, clearances, tackles, and scoring. 4 major stat categories that they just were nowhere near around the mark. I actually, looking at that number, gobsmacked me when researching for this video because I just couldn't believe that a team who ranked so low in so many important areas managed to win enough games to finish 7th, but I guess that's 2019 for you. Fortunately, some of the talent on their team managed to mask some of that poor gameplay that they had going on. Anthony McDonald-Tupengudi still needs to work on his consistency as a player and affect more games throughout the year, but for the most part, I thought he had a pretty good year. Whereas Andy McGrath continued to improve and only got better as the season went on, and for mine was clearly their best in that final against West Coast. Zach Merritt picked up after a slow start, Dyson Heppel continued to do what he was going to do, and Jake Stringer was probably their MVP, playing some really valuable midfield minutes for them and being probably their best player and their sort of, I guess, biggest energy force in that run of 5 wins where they just sort of cemented their spot as a finals contender. But the Bombers need more, and they need to improve. And how exactly are they going to do that? John Worsfold's still going to be their coach next season until Ben Rutten takes over after that, which means you can assume that there's not going to be a drastic style change or a game plan change. And also, they sort of sold the future off to get Dylan Shiel, so they're not going to enter the draft this year with a particularly strong hand. So in terms of list improvement, they kind of either need to look to make a trade, perhaps Orazio Fantasia, who's signalled that maybe he wants to go home to South Australia, or perhaps just dip into free agency again, which doesn't seem like a talented pool this year, or at least too talented compared to what it's been in the past. But to kind of look on the bright side a little more, they do get Devon Smith back, who missed most of this year and the year before was completely influential. If they can get him back to his pressure forward best, that's going to be a massive boost for this side, as he can also rotate through the midfield and sort of alleviate some of the stress left on McGrath. Maybe even Shiel would have a better year, Merritt, Heppel, and guys like that who have taken on some really big loads this year. But does that alone move the Bombers into the top tier of the competition? No, is the short answer. I don't exactly know how they're going to get back into the top 6, top 5 teams and how they're going to actually compete and press to go deeper in the finals. Health might just be a big part of it. They do need to just have a really good clean run, but without much leverage in the off season and much that they can really go do, list manager Adrian Dodoro is going to have to get really creative to see what he can do to bring this team to another level. My assumption for the Bombers is that they kind of stay where they are. That may not be in the top 8, but in terms of in the race for those bottom spots within the top 8, it's hard to see them regressing too far down the ladder when they've got the sort of talent they do, unless some of the teams below them decide that they're actually going to take a step forward, which could make life really hard for a Bombers outfit that's more or less going to be the same. Sides like Fremantle, Hawthorn, and perhaps even North Melbourne, if they can get their act together, may be able to challenge them for those spots, but for the most part, I see Essendon as a good contender and being able to hold their weight in that category. But again, referring to the fans, that's not going to be good enough for them. They want more. They want to turn this burnt out car into a Ferrari and get the keys and get it up and running. So somehow the Bombers need to find a way to keep progressing on the path that they're on, yet take a mighty leap forward. So I guess that's my review of Essendon's 2019 season. Some of you might have actually asked why I was a little bit harsh on the Bombers given they made finals. It's mainly because the preseason expectations on them were quite high. I actually forgot about this before researching, but I did go back and have a look, and there were a lot of people that thought the Bombers could be a top 4 team. And really, even though they made it to 7th, they didn't even look close. So there has to be some judgment there. But I guess you're right. they did make the finals and they had a crack. And maybe if they didn't have to travel to Perth to play West Coast, they would have broken their drought. Who knows? So they also get a bit of a pass on that from me. So I'm going to give the Bombers a C, just a base C, because I don't really know where to put them. So thanks so much for joining me and tuning in. We'll be cranking out more reviews on AFL Access as finals contenders continue to get knocked out. I believe next up I've got West Coast, which should be fun after Ryan was somehow allowed to have Fremantle. So I'm looking forward to dissecting that and trying to find some bad areas of their game to highlight and really make an emphasis of in the video. If you did like this video, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe, and also be sure to head over and join our Discord server. But for now, thanks for watching.